So good afternoon. My name is Colin Dewar, Director of External Relations at the BC Council for International Education. I would like to welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar. I think it will be informative, important, and probably more so timely right now. This afternoon's webinar is entitled Building Unity Through the Pandemic, Addressing Xenophobic Attitudes and Behaviors. This afternoon is co-hosted by SIETAR BC and the BC Council, BC Council for International Education. The Council is a Crown agency advancing international education in concert with the province and the Ministry of Advanced Education Skills Training and the international education sector in British Columbia. Before we start, I would like to welcome today's guests, Jessie Sutherland, Director of Intercultural Strategies. She's on the screen with me. We also have Queenie Chu, CEO of Success. Thank you for joining us, Queenie. And Don Wilson of SIETAR BC. Before we get going, we just have a couple other items to cycle through here. I would like to acknowledge that we at BCCIE are on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish people of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'd also like to give a big shout out to Vancouver Island University. They have very generously supported and sponsored today's webinar. So thank you again, VIU, for being a partner on this one as well. A few housekeeping items for you. So everybody has a control panel, and you won't be using it very much, but you can click it to click in the view area, and on the menu you can uncheck auto hide. So everybody will also be on auto mute. Not that we don't want to hear directly from you, but we are very fortunate to have over 274 attendees at today's webinar, which is a real testament, I think, to the importance of the topic. So we're delighted to have that, but if you're all talking at the same time, it would be quite difficult for us. That said, on the control panel, there's a questions box, and we welcome your comments and questions. And nearing the end of the webinar, we'll have an opportunity to answer some of those questions with the panelists. For the questions we don't get to, we look forward to putting those into a format and having them available post-webinar for you to review as well. So at this point, I'd like to introduce and welcome Dawn Wilson from SIETAR BC to say a few words about the Society, and she'll also offer a proper introduction for our panelists as well. Dawn?
Thank you, Colin. So first of all, I'd like to begin by thanking BCCIE and Vancouver Island University for making this webinar possible. I don't think we could have done it by ourselves. Just a little bit about SIETAR. We're a small nonprofit organization run entirely by volunteers, and we're part of a global network, but we're the only chapter in BC. Our mandate is to provide education around intercultural competence, diversity and inclusion, and anti-racism education. We support a wide range of professionals across the province, including educators, administrators, consultants, and people from a wide variety of different sectors. We offer 6 to 8 events per year, and we're always welcoming new members. So I would invite you to visit our website and send us an email if you have any questions. I think that the events of the past few weeks have certainly highlighted the importance of the work that SIETAR does. First of all, through an intercultural lens in looking at examining the ways that different countries and jurisdictions have responded to the pandemic, and certainly, of course, in providing a forum to acknowledge and discuss some of the racially motivated incidents that have been occurring across Canada and North America in general. So on that note, I wanted to introduce our presenters who are making this webinar possible. First of all, Jessie Sutherland, the Director of Intercultural Strategies. She's an expert trainer, author, and public speaker who has worked with numerous different organizations on engaging diversity, building a culture of belonging, and fostering intercultural collaboration. She will tie in her trademarked Belonging Matters framework to our current COVID-19 situation. Jessie will be interviewing Queenie Chu, CEO of Success. Success is now the largest non-profit social organization in Canada, which provides settlement services to new immigrants through 30 locations in BC and pre-arrival services overseas. Queenie is an advocate on many different committees, and most recently, the Premier's Economic Recovery Task Force. That'll be really important. As an Asian Canadian, Queenie has direct experience of the impact that the coronavirus pandemic has had on her community. So Jessie, over to you. Thank you.
Just before Jessie, we would like to offer a very quick lightning poll for the attendees today who are in our virtual room. So I'm going to put up a poll, and if you don't mind quickly answering it, and then almost immediately I will share those results with you. The poll is designed just to give us a snapshot of where attendees are coming from today in terms of their point of view and their kind of posture towards the subject matter. So I'm just going to put that up now and launch the poll. So I think this should be up on your screen. So if you wouldn't just take a minute to submit your answer, and then in a few seconds, I will close the poll and we'll be able to share those results. Okay, I'm going to close the poll in a 3, 2, 1. Okay. And those are the results. So again, this gives us a bit of a snapshot of where people are coming from. A large portion coming from the education sector in terms of your interest in the subject, bystander, leaders, target, and there's other category as well. So thank you very much for that. This will help, I think, shape some of the discussion that Jessie and Queenie will be having moving forward. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over the mic to Jessie and eventually Queenie when she proceeds with the interview. So Jessie, thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. It's such an honor to be part of this critical conversation about a topic that is so close to my heart and obviously close to the hearts and minds of everyone on this call. So I just want to say a big thank you and kudos to all the partners that came together to make it possible, and for everyone to have carved out time in their day so that we can all pull together on this. We're seeing in Canada and elsewhere that COVID-19 is surfacing all the cracks in our relationships and our systems. And I see this as a choice point where we can either widen and deepen those cracks by putting our heads in the sand, or we can seize this opportunity for all of us to roll up our sleeves and together address each crack. So now let's look at some recent examples of a glaring crack, the xenophobia and racism in our communities. When I'm thinking of social problems, I like to see them as a compass in a way, pointing us to the relationships and systems that need strengthening. So there's numerous situations across Canada and around the world of xenophobia and racism, but here are just 4 quick examples. As we know, Dr. Tam, Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, has been trolled and harassed on social media. A key way that xenophobia and racism can manifest is when we discredit and diminish expertise. And we saw, and also question people's allegiance. We saw this with 9/11 and questioning Barack Obama's origins and his allegiance. And again, we're seeing it again in this context. We're seeing it in Quebec with Dr. Joanne Liu, who's the former president of Doctors Without Border, who led efforts against Ebola and offered to help Quebec. And she talks about feeling benched. So they didn't take her up on her offer. And some people talk about it like having the best general in the world right at your doorstep and putting them in an infantry position instead of a general position, because she's working in one of the hospitals and not leading the response to the pandemic. So these are ways that can manifest that are often glossed over. We're often looking at more extreme examples like the next one of hate crimes, which can look like intimidation, harassment, vandalism, or physical assault. And I think this one is close to many of our minds in BC. For those that aren't in BC, just recently there was a physical assault on an Asian Canadian man at a grocery store, convenience store, with a man that yelled racist slurs and pushed him out of the store and down onto the ground. So this would be considered a hate crime. And then, of course, there's the everyday racism, the shunning and the scapegoating, whether it's referring to COVID-19 as the quote unquote China virus, or whether in the early days before we were even social distancing, people moving seats on buses from anyone of Asian heritage, or crossing streets, or shunning in those kinds of ways. And we know the impact is tremendous on emotions, but also financially. I think we all heard on the radio how many people very early on stopped going to Asian restaurants locally. So the lenses that we use to examine a problem guide us in what we see, how we think, and where we put our efforts. So on the next slide, I'd like to discuss a little bit using the belonging lens as a lens to look at this issue. So the way that I think about this is that at the heart of any given social problem, you'll always find a group of people who feel pushed out. And in this framework, they are the experts because they know how they were pushed out and what values were eroded in the process. So obviously, in a case of xenophobia and racism, people who are most impacted by xenophobia and racism are the experts. And so it's a two-way relationship to build a culture of belonging. On the one hand, the people most impacted have a journey. Often their journey involves asserting their voice, their dignity, and their leadership. And that involves drawing on radical courage to trust again, because often in these kinds of situations, we saw in the convenience store, but it's almost like a metaphor of being pushed out of networks of relationships and systems can erode trust in profound ways in our institutions and the people around us. So it involves drawing on radical courage to trust again, to develop your unique voice, and in some cases experience agency again. There can be a fear of sticking your head above the radar. Everyone wants to, once you've been pushed out, you just want to keep your head under the radar. And when we do that, we lose out on so many of the gifts and talents, like we see with Dr. Tam, Dr. Liu, that when people stick their head above the radar, what can happen? So all of that takes tremendous courage. And then also what can help is experiencing being a valued member of the community for your unique voice, talents, and gifts. But that's only one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is everyone else that is less impacted. Of course, we are all impacted. No one likes to see another human being hurt. And we're certainly seeing that in the pandemic, that we now know, we've always known, but we're getting proven over and over again that we are interdependent. What affects one person affects us all. But in this framework, the role of everyone else is to listen to the people most impacted and actually act on what we hear. So we leverage all our strengths and resources to support the voice, dignity, and leadership of those most impacted, because we recognize they are the experts in this situation. We make sure to create space so that we have shared decision-making power in our institutions and in whatever systems that we're working in. We influence those decision-making spaces, because we're talking about relationships, but we're also talking about system change. And we ensure to recognize contributions. So I'm sure Dr. Joanne Leo would appreciate that in this moment, and Dr. Tam. And all of this requires practicing new skills. So I just wanted to briefly share this framework so that I can introduce Queenie Chu in the most appropriate way because she is certainly an expert. She has personal experience, and she's been serving communities in British Columbia and across Canada that are directly impacted. And so I'm thrilled to be exploring this belonging lens with Queenie Chu and getting into this juicy conversation. Welcome, Queenie.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to make sure that my audio is good. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Thank you. And I wanted to thank the invite by Jessie as well as BCCIE and also SIETAR for this meaningful panel discussion.
Great. Thank you, Queenie. And, you know, to get started, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about what having a sense of home means to you.
Well, the sense of home is really creating a safe place and a sense of belonging for the individuals to reside, whether it is your home dwelling or Canada as your home.
Awesome. And then when you think about that sense of home, what creates that sense of home for you and communities you serve, but even starting with yourself, what are some elements that create that sense of home?
Thank you, Jessie, for the question. I think that the sense of home is we support one another, we help one another out, and we stand shoulder to shoulders with each other, like family members. We support one another, our community, as a country, that we embrace the values, the common values that we and dear to our heart. And in terms of challenges and difficult times, we support one another. That's a sense of belonging. Is vitally important. The sense of safety, the sense of belongings, and being included in the conversation should any of the issues happen.
And when you have that sense of home, what happens? What are the benefits? Like, what are the things that can happen when you really truly feel you belong and have a sense of home?
And I think that certainly, you know, I can only speak for myself, but I'm sure that many of you probably have a similar kind of feelings about, you know, that the benefit of being in a home is where we collaborate, we support one another. We have ups and downs, but we shoulder to shoulder to ensure people are supported, or, you know, certainly, you know, as a family member or living at home, we feel safe, and there's a sense of belonging that we belong to this home, or the place we call home as our country. So the benefit is we shoulder to shoulder to one another to stand firm on our common values.
Yeah, awesome. And then what are things that dismantle a sense of home for you?
Well, certainly when things happen and that kind of trust got eroded, partially or entirely the trust, you know, that being removed from, and you know, people feel very upset and dismayed for the people betraying your trust in them and in the community, and you know, at the home as a family. I think that the betrayal, the sense of disruption to the sense of belongings and safety, respect, will be subsequently also be disrupted in these situations.
And do you have any personal experiences or a story that pops in your mind that sort of demonstrates this dismantling of home, of trust? This disruption, I think you talk about it as a disruption of trust in another conversation we have, and I thought that was quite a beautiful way of looking at it.
So certainly as a Canadian, as a Chinese Canadian, you know, the recent situation of the physical assault to the 92-year-old gentleman who has a severe dementia and being thrown out of the convenience store, that hit home, you know, in terms of, you know, people in the community that are supporting one another. We're supposed to be embracing our values of diversity and inclusion. Not even talking about people with that advanced age with dementia who are so vulnerable that we should have been extending our help. That really hit home in terms of that trust is being disrupted.
What kind of things did it bring up for you personally? Was there any memory that came for you, or what? Can you tell me a little bit more about how it hit home and how that might have disrupted your own sense of home to know that that was happening in our community?
So certainly, you know, the values, the fundamental values of Canadians, and we always said, you know, we do things in a Canadian ways, really is to extend our help to the vulnerable people, to those people who needs whether it's service or help in a very challenging situation like the COVID-19 pandemic. And certainly this type of behaviors is very disturbing to many of us because it's counterproductive to the values that we have wholly trusted our community members to embrace all those values that we uphold so deeply as a Canadian. And certainly regardless of a race, color, background, and education and gender, there's no way that this behavior would be acceptable in our community.
And when you're thinking about, I love how you go straight to the erosion of values just naturally. If you were to identify, let's say, the top 5 values that are eroded in situations like that, what do you see them as? You've mentioned trust, respect,
compassion, dignity, you know, security, you know, the value of respect and the sense of pride and all those kind of things that, you know, the sense of honesty and integrity, you know, all those values that we so hold true to our heart as a Canadian, I think is being eroded when those behaviors are displayed.
You know, you mentioned dignity, and I'm just going to pull that one out as an example because I find people that aren't impacted by certain social problems often don't realize the erosion, the shame that is involved when you're pushed out. And of course, this convenience store is like flagrant, actual physical pushing out, whereas there can be a sense of being pushed out by racist jokes or misinformed accusations. Like we talked about China virus, the two of you, how that has been circulating amongst some people. So I think it would be helpful for people to understand, like, how does these incidents evoke shame in people and the impact of shame?
Right, absolutely. I think that also the fact that politicizing certain disease, you know, is coronavirus right now, but there was Ebola before in Africa. So are we labeling those diseases as part of the way to looking at you know, the racism as a whole, or politicizing it, calling it China virus? So I think these are the real concerns, real issues if we don't address it properly.
And so when you think of these values that have been eroded, and I keep coming back to this because years ago I did some research looking at the rise and fall of cultures and civilizations around the world and throughout time. And one of the common factors at the disintegration before a culture either collapses or a culture strengthens itself and regenerates is the erosion of values. And what makes the difference between a culture that survives at the disintegration phase is whether people reconnect to their core values and address problems from their values. So when you're thinking about these values that you mention, how can people draw on those values to address some of these racist comments, these misinformed comments that are obviously dismantling a sense of home and belonging for many people?
I think that it's important that, certainly I hope it's is a small number of people who displaying this kind of behavior. But I think that what's been motivating to those behavior needs to be addressed. And also, certainly, from all levels of our, governments, and need to kind of continue to look at reinforcing, those behaviors totally unacceptable in our country and in our community. And also I think that it's time to really raise the awareness, if ever than before, when people are under a lot of stress, and we're hoping these behavior or the racializing the virus is not going to prevail, and hoping through education and heightened awareness what needs to be done in those situations hopefully will help those people who are in this situation as well.
So someone that, let's say there's somebody that is observing one of these misinformed, as you put it, comments, these racist comments. If you're observing a verbal attack, what are ways do you think a bystander, when you looked at even the convenience store, it started with racial slurs and racial attacks, and then it escalated to physical assaults. What are some of your thoughts that a bystander how could they respond to situations like this that would be helpful?
Well, I think that it is important that this kind of incident be reported to the police authority while maintaining the safety of those bystanders, because those situations, it could be very violent. It could turn into a situation where the bystanders or those people were involved will be affected severely. So we want to make sure the bystanders, while they needed to report those incidents, but also at the same time protecting themselves. So I would suggest to make sure the bystander understand also what situation they are in. And secondly is, when there is opportune time, is to report to the police right away, while maintaining the situation so that no one will get hurt.
Excellent. And when a bystander actually acts, listens, notices, and acts on what they hear, what values can they be drawing on to kind of be the fuel for that?
Well, I think those are kind of things we needed to make sure that the situation, those people really experiencing those personal firsthand situation, really speak out to those incidents or behaviors that totally has no place in our community, has no place in Canada, and no place in anywhere we live in our country. So I think while you're a bystander, but there is also opportunity by the bystander to speak for the fact that those are unacceptable behavior.
Yeah, so not sticking our heads in the sand and finding our voice to support those most impacted as well, and create the kind of community that will make us all safe in the long run and healthy.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, I went to a webinar that was put on by Asian Americans for Justice and Hollaback, and they talk about bystander. They give some tips on bystanders, so maybe I'll slip a couple of them in there. They too are totally in alignment with what you're saying, that safety is paramount, so never to put yourself in a situation that could harm yourself. But how key it is to do something, and there's many things you can do other than directly intervene, although sometimes if it's safe, that's the most important thing to do. They talk about distracting. You can drop something in between the person that's being assaulted or verbally attacked and ask for help to pick it up. And that there's a lot of science in neurobiology is that when a person's brain is focused on something else, wonder or curiosity, it's impossible to be violent at the same time. They talk about delegating, so finding someone, asking someone to go call the police while you document, and the other piece is documenting the incident, because when we're harmed like that, our brains are impacted by a kind of trauma that it can be hard to remember the details. So a bystander can have a really great role in documenting things and making sure to give it to the person targeted so they can are in charge of it, not to go with the information and share it publicly, because it could be something they want to keep private. So all those pieces are just some of the other ways they talk about doing that. So they call it the 5 Ds. And if there was a follow-up webinar to this, we could do a deeper dive. But just so people listening have a sense of what they are, it is distracting, delegating, documenting, and I'd have to look up the fourth one here, and also the direct confrontation, which is very simple, simple and assertive techniques that they use. So I just wanted to add that to what you were sharing there, Queenie, because I think they've done some excellent work, American Asians for Justice and Hollaback collaboration around the bystander piece. I think every culture has a different way of addressing confrontation like that, and that piece of being connected to what your values are and finding the method that is right and culturally appropriate and safe for you is pretty key. So those are some things like that, values that can be drawn on to address that bystanders can do. But what about, I mean, the other piece you had talked about is understanding the motivation. So do you have any recommendations for someone that might have a bias that burbles up for themselves? Maybe they don't even say it out loud. Other people say it out loud and harm others, but others might just have it in their head. What are ways that people could reflect and shift their own biases?
Well, I think the individual or unconscious bias actually reside in any one of us. You know, there are certain unconscious bias in every one of us. I think we needed to kind of have some reflection or really looking at the situation, you know, in an open and, you know, transparent manners. So thinking it out loud is that always put yourself in other people's shoes, you know, and how that message is being received. You know, if those verbal racial slur is being displayed or spoke out, how the receiver is going to interpret those information. And also, secondly, is also be aware who is around you. Have that heightened awareness of who around you and how those messages are being interpreted or misinterpreted as racial slur. I think those are very important for, you know, is very much, you know, is the way you communicate and how the message is being received. The other piece about the bias, you know, as all of us understand, when children were raised, they don't have any inherent bias. The bias develop over time when people being brought up and raised and being influenced by the environment, by things happen surrounding us. So if we could be more conscious or make ourselves more aware what's happening around us and be able to really looking at, you know, how this bias is going to be hurtful to other people as well.
That's great. And you talked about earlier, like addressing the motivation. So would you see, you mentioned stress. In this situation, there might be fear of getting sick and what that would, all the consequences of getting sick. So that piece of self-reflection, and you mentioned, just informing yourselves of what are the actual facts. Sometimes I refer to this as the facts are friendly. So how are viruses actually created and spread rather than the misinformation that politicizes and racializes a virus. And knowing that any given country or culture, a virus could start from, and do we want to be scapegoated? So that those are powerful pointers that you've given, Queenie, around what would that be like for us if there was a new virus that started right here in British Columbia and then the whole world called it the BC virus. What would that be like? And
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I think, Jessie, you hit the nail on the head. No one wants to be labeled, okay? And labeling, it could be very hurtful to people. And so just, again, think about the way that is being communicated. And in a time like the coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic crisis, this is a time for us to stick together, stand side by side to combat this virus, okay? So rather than, having those racial slur, which is so divisive among ourselves, it's not going to help us at all. But this really disrupting the opportunity for us to stick together, to fight the virus together, and to get this back into business, to get our economy back into business. And this is really what we wanted to do, so that we get our job back and we return as children to school, and hopefully, there will be a new normal as soon as possible for every one of us. So this is not the time to tear us apart. And that remains my key messages, so that no one will be hurt in this crisis.
So critical. I love it. And certainly the racism and xenophobia that is surfacing is pointing to this flagrant crack in our system and relationships. And so perhaps it's a call to action to everyone to strengthen their relationships or build them for the first time. And I know in my life, when I have gotten to try and know a new culture, if I'm not already close to one, that I see as being targeted. Often I read novels by their famous authors, go to their festivals, watch their movies, and build relationships with actual people. It's very hard to be close, have a close relationship, and keep a bias in place. And so with this, with COVID-19 and the emerging events that we're seeing, has been a call to action for me. It's been great. Queenie, I don't think we talked in the last 5 years, but it's brought us together and strengthened our relationship, and many other people that I haven't talked to since the 80s or 90s in anti-racism movements and with Asian Canadians. So that piece of when racism is like a compass pointing us to the relationships we need strengthening. These are all great tools that you're sharing with us. And I'm also mindful of I think it was 4% of people on this call have experienced being a target. And I want to say I'm extremely sorry to those people about having experienced that. And I wonder, Queenie, do you have something you'd like to tell them around how to self-care if you've been to the target? And I'm thinking about, that framework around how do you preserve your own sense of dignity and safety and trust? What are ways that you would recommend for people on the call that have been targets to take care of themselves?
Well, I think that first of all, if there is a situation where the individual is being targeted, they should actually, if it is a hate crime, somebody got hurt physically, then they should actually report to the police. There is a hate crime division within the police force So that needs to be reported right away, because then the proper authority will have to make sure, those incidents that being reported is not underreported, because as you heard that on the media that hate crime against anyone has been underreported, particularly the recent incident of the assault against the Canadian Asian man. That certainly it give us the more insight into hate crime is being underreported. So I think this needs to be addressed to help those people who have had the experience in those terrible situations. And the second thing is those people who are affected needs to, if they really need some help, they need to seek help, whether it's a counselor or whether it's a psychologist. I think it's okay to get help, so that they will be able to address the issue and be able to heal. I think healing is important before get into the next situation again, because we don't want people to have that compounded issues just bottle inside without the healing process to take place. So external help would be perfectly okay to seek help. But thirdly, I think that again, if those people who are not directly affected but are bystanders, stand up for those issues, as you, Jesse, had provided some options and tools from the toolkit that we can do to address the issue, so that people understand this is absolutely not acceptable in our community, nor any of the racializing of any of our diseases. That's not acceptable, and that's not the way to express people's anger or distress. That's not acceptable at all.
So important. And I think, for people on the call, that one of the big aha moments in my journey around this has been the awareness of one of the worst parts of being pushed out of systems and networks of people or experiencing things like this is the lack of action by the bystanders. It's one thing when a bully or someone that is saying a racist slur or a hate crime is doing something, that's bad enough. But what's really painful, that lingers the longest, is the scars from observers doing nothing. And research shows that, let's say I don't know the exact stats, but it's about 7 to 8%, I believe, that are going to do something horrible like that. And the vast majority are just silent, and there's only 7 to 8 that'll actually stand up and say something as a bystander. And so the majority are doing nothing. And it's the easiest people to sway are the majority doing nothing that don't necessarily agree, but just need to learn to stand up and do something. And that links to the 5th D. I looked it up while you were chatting, is that the group, the Asian Americans for Justice and Hollaback talk about, is delay. That there's significant research that if someone has experienced a racist assault and no one has done anything or even come to them later, that the trauma lingers much longer. But even one person giving a compassionate look or going up to the person and saying, "Hey, are you okay? How can I help?" That's the part around agency, making sure that the people most impacted have agency and choice around how something is handled. Then the trauma will be significantly reduced. So they talk about that if it isn't safe and you need to wait, even going later and checking in with the person will have a huge impact. So the last question, Queenie, is there's a lot of educators on the phone. Do you have any calls to action for them?
Certainly, we rely heavily on the educator to make sure those knowledge or new knowledge that people have not yet acquired, we'll have those information and knowledge available. Seminar like this, panel discussion like this, and also create an environment where people would be able to talk about their feelings if they were affected in those situations, and how can people heal together and supporting one another. So I think the educators play an important, vitally important role to help those majority of people that Jesse, you mentioned, like over 80% of the population who are not really the offender. They are the one who actually could be silent, or could be speaking out, or could be not knowing what to do. So I think the educators really play a very important role to make sure those right information is getting to the right people at the right time.
Awesome. And do you have anything that you'd like to add around how what everyone's role is in preventing this and creating the home that we all yearn for?
Well, I think that certainly, I mentioned a panel discussion, something like that, is very timely to address the issue. But also, I think that over time, let's not forget the trauma that created and incurred to the person that affected. So let's not forget them.
Yeah.
I think that we learn from one another. We learn from our elders, and we learn from the community. You know, certainly we have to signal stronger, more than ever, this kind of racialized behavior or hate crime have no place in our community. I think this is our majority. If this is a majority view, I think that then this kind of exceptional behaviors that we don't want to have in our community will be eradicated.
Great, thank you. You've given us so much to chew on in terms of starting to build our toolbox, and I thank you so much. So if we can move to the next slide, we're just going to review a little bit around our journey so far and our toolbox that we're building. But Queenie, this has been exceptional, all that you're sharing on so many levels.
Thank you.
So there'll be a workbook that comes with this webinar that you'll have access to, and I'll just flag a little bit here around building our toolbox and the Belonging Matters framework, because every culture deals with different situations differently. However, there can be some pre-pathways to get there, and we've kind of done the path through this interview. First, it's naming the problem, noticing something. So if you see or hear racist or xenophobic attitude or behavior, it's like naming the problem. And often in the workbook, there's a little bit more around noticing first what your trigger is or your echo. If you've been a target before, you might be going through freeze, fight, or flight mode and taking care of those triggers and emotions. But even if you haven't been a target, it might bring up other experience of confrontation. And so we need to take care of whatever is triggering us, and so that we're able to act. And when we can, it's like digging for the value. If we don't dig for the value at stake that we're standing for, we won't have the fuel or momentum to be able to address it effectively. And then thinking through how can we draw on these values to address the problem, so that if dignity and respect is getting eroded, that we're not eroding that value further in the way that we address it, that we are standing for and living out that value. And sometimes people don't change, as we all know. And so once we've identified the value that's been eroded, so obviously in our communities, racism and xenophobia is showing us that these values, Queenie has pointed out, has been eroded for all of us, right? If it's being targeted towards Asian Canadians, it's just a compass showing that those values are on low, and we need to start living them out and strengthening them in our moment-to-moment actions. So I just want to flag in the workbook that you'll be getting in a follow-up email, they'll have a step-by-step process around using a values-based problem-solving approach to racist and xenophobic attitudes and behaviors. And then just to do a recap on the next slide and our journey so far. Oh, sorry, no, we're doing question and answer, sorry. I got that wrong. So we're gonna open it up to some questions.
Great. Thank you, Jesse and Queenie. That was really, really insightful. I appreciate it very much. We have a number of outstanding questions, so I think we have a few minutes maybe to go through a couple of them. One I'd like to share with you both. We had a question about how to encourage people that have been targets or victims of xenophobia or racism. For those that are especially find it difficult, either culturally, if they're international students, if they're not permanent residents, do you have any tips or advice about how those people can gather the courage and how they can best address racism and xenophobia in this context?
I certainly happy to answer to that question if you like.
Thank you.
I'm sure counselors available at the university or schools that they could seek help from. If not, I think that there's also services like Success. We offer counseling services, and language is not an issue. We have 50 language bank among our staff, so certainly we'll be more than happy to support the individual. However, again, I wanted to also emphasize that, hopefully the individual is aware that there is proper authorities to report those incidents to, and making sure those are reported to ensure their safety as well. And whether it is a police authority or, a hate crime unit within the police division, there is provisions for it. And I think it is so important to report those incidents to those proper authority so that this can be addressed, so that this similar incident would not happen to anybody else in the future.
Wonderful.
I'd like to add something to that, if that's
Thanks,
all right. Those are awesome. Thank you, Queenie. I'd just like to add just the awareness of the incredible sense of personal, family, and community cultural shame that an experience like this can have on someone, and the erosion of trust to anyone. So just knowing that scaffolding sometimes have to be put into place for someone to even reach out to a counselor or to even a friend. And the first step might be just talking to your best friend or a family member, and it might take a while. What I've found is one of the best antidotes to shame is peer support. So in incidences like this, there are belonging matters conversations where people who have experienced similar things can share stories. And once you realize you're not alone and you explore the situation in a values-based way, people start finding their voice and coming up with their own ideas on how to address the problem. So I just want to flag the role of shame and peer support.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jesse and Queenie. Okay, I'm going to pose a second question. This is related to how to help those and to address interactions with people who do not probably and will not adopt those values that we're talking about today. So that don't share kind of the basic shared sense of values, how best to approach either these groups or individuals.
Did you want to go first, Queenie, or do you want me to take that one for?
Sure, and then I'll add on.
I think it's always important to think through where you want to put your efforts and in what situation. If you're in a leadership role, by all means, you need to implement the policies and practices that will set the tone in your organization, and you should have diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and practices. And if you don't, they need to be built and learn how to implement them. But if you're just or it might be a family member that you're willing to whittle away with for years, it can take years. And just reminding yourself, for the most part, it's the minority, if we can shift the silent majority, that's going to be probably your biggest bang for the buck. But if you do want to, or you might be in a direct confrontation situation where you do have to intervene, what the Asian Americans for Justice and Hollaback recommend is finding one-liners and very direct. You need to stop, you need to leave, you need to, and just repeat, repeat, repeat. Because what you want to do is stop the activity that is happening that's creating harm, and do that in whatever ways you can. And of course, I always go back to facts are friendly. What are the facts? Usually there's misinformation. So what are the facts that we can give to people that might help shift? Generally, it's emotional based, and they need more help on that emotional level of fear and motivation.
So as an organization, I know there are also leaders on the call on this webinar, and certainly I'm sure there are rules and regulation, policy and procedure for people to comply. And really, you know, when you're looking at the person who persistently or would not change the behavior, so I think one needs to make sure the individual understand, one is, do they actually subscribe the values of the organization? Two is, whatever the action of the individual, people need to understand there is also consequences to that actions. So I think people need to understand that if the person's individual value system do not or does not coincide or really, you know, what the organization support, then the person might not be a good fit into the organization, as each of the action by the individual also needs to be addressed as well when they violate those kind of value system within their organization, whether it's educational institution or any of the social service or other corporate organization. I think one needs to reinforce that.
Great. Thank you so much for that. We're about to finish, but I just want to give a little bit of space to a few questions that we can't get to, and maybe a suggestion for a part 2 or follow-up, as referenced earlier. There was a number of questions around inclusion of Indigenous concerns and issues into this very discussion. We talked about the sense of home and place, and where does that factor in? And I think this would be a really important area. It was noted in at least 2 or 3 questions that I'm looking at here. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And I know Jesse's done a lot of work in this area as well. So looking forward to, I hope, a continuation of this, a really, really important dialogue. I'm going to thank our presenters. I think we're largely out of time. I would like to finish right at 1 p.m. today. As Jesse mentioned, in terms of follow-up, we do have a workbook that will be available when you go into our survey, and we'd love your feedback for today's webinar. And again, this helps shape future offerings for both BCCIE and SIETAR as well. Very important dialogue, and we look forward to doing our best to continue and keep this discussion live. Again, the workbook, and for further information from both BCCIE and SIETAR, please visit our offerings and these websites. And with the questions, we look forward to pulling those together and bringing in some response and further discussion post-webinar as well. So thank you so much for submitting those, and we will take those to heart and do our best to respond to them. So I'm going to thank our presenters, Jesse and Queenie and Don Wilson from SIETAR again. And I think we'll leave it there. If you'd like to say goodbye, that would be great. But otherwise, we'll close the webinar at this point.
Thank you, and stay safe.
Thank you, everybody, and Queenie.
Thank you, everyone, and take care, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.